It's The Real Deal, episode 27. And today's question is, how has the practice of real estate changed since the NAR settlement went into effect in mid-August 2024? So lawsuits that came up that led to the NAR settlement, that's National Association of Realtors, stemmed from people alleging there were anti-competitive practices in how real estate commissions were being shared. And this led to the NAR agreeing to make changes that led them to make known to practitioners of real estate agents, that is, that the way things would be moving forward would be new and different. So what are those changes? Well, first is that buyer agreements are now mandatory in writing. So previously, an agent could meet with a buyer and show them properties without having executed in writing a written agreement. But now, since the NAR settlement on August 17th, 2024 went into effect, a real estate agent and a buyer must have a written agreement in place before touring homes. And the agreement will make known what the buyer has agreed to compensate the agent if they pursue and purchase a home that the agent has introduced them to and assisted them with in presenting an offer on. So that's new. For my entire career, it wasn't required to have a written agreement in place with a buyer before showing a home. Now, under the new rules, a buyer and a buyer's agent can either have a showing agreement in place for a specific property or properties, or they can have a full-fledged buyer agency agreement. In either case, there will be clear communication in writing through the written agreement as to what the buyer is agreeing to pay the buyer's agent if they purchase a home through the buyer's agent that the agent has shown them. And it's typically expressed as a percentage of the purchase price. So again, it's a new development, and it's one that's taking many people by surprise who are so acclimated to calling up a real estate agent or office and asking to see 123 Main Street, and an agent agrees to do that and shows them the home, and then if they're interested can assume the responsibility of being their buyer's agent, all of which could have happened in the past without a written agreement in place. So mandatory buyer agreements now are required if you wish to see a home with an agent who is going to be there on your behalf as a buyer's agent. The second significant change in the post-settlement world is sellers or their agents can no longer be required to offer compensation to buyer agents via MLS. So previously, commission sharing was a standard practice, and in the old days, prior to the settlement, it was the case that you could go into MLS as an agent and look at every listing listed there and discover, by looking at the listing information for each listing, what the compensation on offer was to the buyer's agent. So that's no longer a requirement. In fact, many MLSs are not allowing compensation fields to be included. The thing that's sort of subtle here is, in the world gone by, compensation would frequently come from the listing agent. So let's say Ace Real Estate signed up a listing with a seller at, say, 5%. And Ace Real Estate's listing agreement would state that Ace Real Estate would agree to share a portion of the commission with the buyer agent office that had the buyer agent that brought the buyer. So they might offer out a 2.5% blanket offer of compensation to the buyer agent. So in MLS, in the days gone by, if Ace Real Estate had 123 Main Street, it might state that the buyer agent offer of compensation on offer here was 2.5%, and that would flow from Ace to the buyer agent office at the closing. Now, in the new world, it's normally the case that there's no indication whatsoever in MLS regarding compensation. Remember, in certain MLSs, you're not even allowed to have this field. But my point here is, in the world gone by, compensation would typically flow to the buyer's agent from the listing agent office. And it was common that the amount on offer would be published in MLS. No longer is that the case. And so what we can say is that and this brings me to my third essential point on how real estate has changed. Buyer agent compensation now is frequently a term of a buyer's offer, with the buyer asking the seller in their offer to pay their buyer agent. Now, before, in the world no longer, it would be that buyer agent compensation would be essentially baked into most listing agreements, and the seller would have agreed to a fee, say 5%, and in the old days in their listing agreement, have agreed to allow the listing agent to share a portion of that 5% with a buyer agent that brought a buyer. That is no longer the way in which real estate is practiced. It is, in fact, now the case that most listing agreements speak to what the seller will pay the listing agent to sell the property. And then the question of what the buyer agent shall be paid ends up becoming a point that is up for discussion. It may be that there is not a blanket offer of compensation. It may be that the seller is choosing to consider agent compensation for the buyer on a case-by-case basis. And it is for this reason that we're seeing, not always, but very often, that a buyer is now writing into their offer that the seller will compensate their agent. So in the world gone by, the buyer agent could count on the listing agent office for compensation. In the new world, post the NAR settlement of mid-August 2024, the buyer is looking now, since the seller is not automatically agreeing to compensate their agent, to write into their offer that the seller shall pay their buyer's agent upon closing. And the reason for that is, since the buyer is now in an agreement in writing with their agent, whereby the buyer agrees to pay their agent an expressed amount for the completion of the purchase of a home, they're seeking to pass that cost on to the seller. And this way, the amount that the agent is owed can be accounted for in the purchase price, and it's not an additional amount outside the total amount agreed to be paid by the buyer for the property. So, in a way, you could argue that even though the mechanics of the reality of the situation have changed, whereas once buyer agent compensation, if you will, was baked into most listing agreements, it's now finding its way, in most instances, to be baked into most offers. And where once it was more common for buyer agent compensation to flow from the listing agent office to the buyer agent office, now it's much more common for compensation to flow from seller to buyer agent. So it's a lot to take in, and it's subtle and complex. But I think, to take it again from the top, if you're a buyer, expect to have a written agreement in place before you look at homes with an agent, and know that that's going to make known that you, the buyer, are responsible for your agent's compensation for the home you purchase. Because of that, it's normal now for a buyer to write into their offer for the seller's consideration that the seller will pay their buyer agent X, right? And the reason that sellers are, for the most part, finding it that they will consider such offers is these are the kinds of offers that are coming in, and they can do the math to determine their net sale price. And, if once upon a time in a world gone by, a seller had agreed to a commission of, say, 5% or 6% to sell their home, it may be now that the way that their listing agreement is structured, the amount that they're going to end up being open to compensating the buyer's agent for might be negotiable. Or it may be that they choose to compensate a buyer's agent for a certain percentage, but even then it's still negotiable. It's still going to end up, in most instances, being a term of the offer, right? So rather than it being baked into a listing agreement, as it was commonly done in the past before the settlement date, now in the new world, it's typically baked into an offer and is considered as part of the offer presented as one of the terms. And so it's not established and decided upon upfront before the home is shown. It's typically now negotiated at the point an offer is presented and received. So it's a lot to take in. As a top agent in the market each and every day, working with buyer and seller clients, I'm exposed to the realities that pertain to the topic and can certainly answer questions that you have as you seek to better understand this new world of real estate and how it's changed on the other side of the mid-August 2024 NAR settlement. My name is Charles Cherney. Reach out at any time by text, telephone, or email if I can be of service to you as you seek to buy the right home or sell for the best price and get a handle on the realities of real estate and commission payments. Be in touch. Take care.